Richard Hayes was known in the corporate world as a cold and calculating magnate. At 52, he had transformed Hayes Corporation, a multinational consumer goods company, into one of the largest in the industry. He lived in a luxurious mansion on the outskirts of Chicago and rarely interacted with employees below the executive level. To him, numbers were everything, and quarterly results spoke louder than any human connection. One day, during a board meeting, Richard heard an observation that unsettled him. One of the executives mentioned that employee turnover among lower-level staff was increasing and anonymous complaints about working conditions were piling up. Richard, who believed his employees should adapt to the company's demands, dismissed the comments as exaggerations. However, something about that meeting lingered in his mind. He realized he had no idea what the day-to-day life of a regular employee at his company was like. What began as a fleeting curiosity soon turned into an audacious plan. He would go undercover as a regular worker to experience the reality of his own company. Richard Hayes had never considered mingling among the employees of his company, but the idea fascinated him. He hired a disguise expert to help create a new identity. The impeccably dressed magnate with a luxury watch was transformed into an average man named Rick Carter, with messy hair, simple clothes, and a rural accent. With the help of the HR department, without anyone knowing his true identity, he was hired as a new employee at one of Hayes Corporation's warehouses located on the outskirts of Chicago. It was a far cry from the sleek offices downtown where Richard spent his days. On his first day, Richard was shocked by the environment, which clashed with his vision of efficiency and order. The warehouse was hot, poorly lit, and the employees seemed overworked. He was introduced to a strict and impatient supervisor, who barely glanced at him before pointing to a pile of boxes. "That's your job, Rick. Load these onto the trucks before the shift ends. No delays." Having never done physical labor in his life, Richard quickly felt the weight of the task. His hands began to ache within the first hour, and he realized he was far slower than his coworkers. While working, Richard overheard conversations around him. Many employees complained about low wages, long overtime hours, and lack of recognition. He noticed some workers appeared especially exhausted. Two, in particular, caught his attention. Maria Torres, a 40-year-old woman working triple shifts to cover the medical bills for her daughter, who urgently needed heart surgery. James Cooper, a 24-year-old young man who visibly limped, enduring intense leg pain. He told another worker he couldn't afford to take time off or see a doctor because he'd lose his job and couldn't pay the medical bills. Richard was confronted with a reality he had never imagined. Maria and James worked at an inhuman pace to support their families, while he, comfortably seated in his office, had never questioned the impact of corporate policies on their lives. On an especially exhausting day, Maria collapsed next to Richard, sitting on a pile of boxes during a short break. He tried offering words of encouragement, but she replied with brutal honesty, "You're new here, Rick. You'll figure out soon enough that we're just disposable cogs in this place. We work until we break, and when we're no longer useful, they replace us." Those words echoed in Richard's mind. For the first time, he saw his company not as a bastion of efficiency, but as a system that exploited people to maintain high profits. As Rick Carter, Richard continued to uncover the harsh realities of the warehouse. Supervisors pressured employees to work faster, co-workers leaned on each other to survive long hours, and the physical and emotional toll was undeniable. The struggles of Maria and James weighed heavily on him. Richard spoke more with Maria and learned that her 8-year-old daughter, Sophia, was waiting for a heart surgery that cost more than she could afford. Despite working triple shifts, her wages barely covered rent and the child's medications. "I think about giving up, but what would my daughter do without me? I just need more time," she told Richard, her eyes brimming with tears. Richard realized his company offered basic health insurance, but many employees couldn't access costly or specialized treatments. It was a system he had approved without understanding its true impact. James, meanwhile, struggled to hide his pain, but his constant limp betrayed his suffering. Richard discovered that James had suffered a workplace injury months earlier, but fear of retaliation and financial constraints prevented him from reporting it. He continued working to support his elderly mother, who depended on his income. Maria and James's stories weighed heavily on Richard's conscience. He began to see the human cost of his relentless pursuit of efficiency and profits. For the first time, he felt responsible not only for the company's financial well-being, but also for the dignity and quality of life of the people who kept it running. One sleepless night, he resolved to act not just for Maria and James, but for all the employees who depended on Hayes Corporation. However, he knew he needed to proceed carefully while still undercover. Richard began taking detailed notes about the warehouse conditions, employee grievances, and systemic flaws. He drafted a plan to reform the company's policies, but first wanted to do something tangible for Maria and James. Using a pseudonym, Richard anonymously transferred the amount needed for Sophia's surgery. When Maria received the news, she was in shock. "Someone paid for this. I don't know who it was, but it feels like a miracle," she told Richard, unaware that he was the benefactor. For James, Richard arranged an anonymous appointment with a specialist. When James returned to work with a brace on his leg and a recovery plan, his relief was evident. "I don't know how this happened, but I finally feel like I have a chance to get better," he told his co-workers. After weeks in the warehouse, Richard felt he had learned enough to implement meaningful changes. He decided it was time to reveal his true identity. At a general meeting with all the employees, Richard removed his disguise and stepped onto a makeshift stage in the warehouse. The silence that followed was almost palpable. Many employees, including Maria and James, were stunned to realize that Rick Carter was, in fact, the CEO of the company. "I came here to understand the reality you face every day," he began. "What I saw and heard has completely changed my perspective. You are not disposable cogs in a machine. You are the heart of Hayes Corporation, and it's my responsibility to ensure you are treated with respect and dignity." The revelation of Richard Hayes as Rick Carter shook the Hayes Corporation warehouse. Employees, accustomed to viewing him as a distant magnate, now saw him as someone who had shared their struggles. While many remained skeptical, Richard's message was clear. He was no longer the leader who prioritized profits above all else. Richard began transforming Hayes Corporation with tangible actions. Improved warehouse conditions. The warehouse underwent urgent renovations. Ventilation systems were installed, lighting was upgraded, and proper break areas were created for employees. Wage increases and benefits. He implemented a significant wage increase for entry-level workers and revised the health insurance plan, ensuring all employees had access to medical treatments, including expensive surgeries, without exorbitant costs. Open communication channels. Richard established an employee committee to directly present workforce concerns to management. He also introduced an anonymous reporting system, allowing employees to raise issues without fear of retaliation. For Maria, the changes brought immense relief. With Sophia's surgery secured, she was able to reduce her working hours and spend more time with her daughter. For the first time in years, she could breathe more easily. James received the support he needed to complete his medical recovery without losing his job. He became an advocate for the changes, encouraging colleagues to participate in the company's new communication system. Richard knew that transforming Hayes Corporation required more than policy changes. It demanded a shift in mindset. He introduced leadership training for supervisors and managers, emphasizing the importance of treating employees with respect and empathy. He also began visiting warehouses regularly, not as Rick Carter, but as Richard Hayes. During these visits, he made a point to speak with workers, listen to their suggestions, and ensure their concerns were taken seriously. A significant event was organized at the company headquarters to celebrate the changes. Richard gave a speech that marked the beginning of a new era for Hayes Corporation. "I've learned more in the past few months than in my entire career. You, the employees, are what make this company possible. My commitment is to lead with humanity because true success cannot exist without respect and dignity." The speech was met with applause, but the real impact was felt in the daily lives of the workers, who finally began to feel valued. The changes at Hayes Corporation caught the attention of the media. Articles highlighted how a CEO had transformed his leadership philosophy after experiencing his employees' working conditions firsthand. Richard was invited to speak at conferences and corporate events, sharing his journey and inspiring other leaders to rethink their practices. For Richard, however, The true recognition came from the words of his employees. During one of his warehouse visits, Maria approached him and said, "You didn't just save my daughter. You saved my hope that work can be more than just survival. Thank you, Mr. Hayes." With the implemented changes, Hayes Corporation began transforming into a model of both humane and efficient management. The reforms not only improved conditions for entry-level employees, but also altered how executives viewed Richard Hayes. The story of the CEO who went undercover as a worker spread, bringing positive attention to the company and attracting new talent. With her daughter Sophia recovering after surgery, Maria flourished both as an employee and as a person. With renewed energy and fewer financial worries, she began leading internal initiatives to support colleagues, helping implement support programs for employees facing challenges like hers. James became a symbol of resilience in the warehouse. Fully recovered, he was promoted to supervisor, where he excelled by leading with empathy and understanding the workers' struggles. He also began studying business administration at night, inspired by the possibility of advancing in a company he now saw as a place of opportunity. Richard's initiatives and the transformative impact on Hayes Corporation began receiving corporate awards and recognition. During a conference in New York, Richard was invited to speak about the motivations behind the changes. Standing before business leaders and journalists, he began with a simple confession: "I was wrong. For years, I saw my employees as numbers on a spreadsheet, not as people with stories, challenges, and hopes. Everything changed when I stepped down from my pedestal to live their reality. Today, I know that a company is only as strong as the respect it shows to those who keep it running." The speech received a standing ovation. Many leaders in the audience approached him afterward, admitting they had been moved by the honesty and courage behind his transformation. While celebrating his successes, Richard received an anonymous letter that intrigued him. It was simple but filled with gratitude. "Mr. Hayes, thank you for not forgetting where you came from. I know your decision to change everything went above and beyond, and as an employee and a human being, I am eternally grateful." Curious, Richard had the letter traced back to its source. He discovered it came from a warehouse employee who had never spoken to him directly, but had felt the impact of his actions. The letter reminded Richard how small gestures and bold decisions could create waves of change. He resolved to do something special to show his appreciation for his employees. On the 50th anniversary of Hayes Corporation, Richard announced an initiative no one expected: the creation of a corporate fund to financially support employees' children in their education and healthcare. The program, named Bright Futures, was met with enthusiasm across the company. During the program's launch ceremony, Maria and James were invited to the stage to share their stories. Maria, emotional, looked out at the audience and said, "This program isn't just about money. It's about hope, something Mr. Hayes gave us when we needed it most. Now, we know we're more than just workers. We're part of a family." That night, after the event, Richard sat alone in his office. He gazed out at the illuminated city skyline and reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. The man he was before going undercover felt like a distant memory. He was no longer just a CEO. He was someone who had found purpose in leading with humanity. And in the end, that was what truly mattered. Years passed, and Hayes Corporation continued to thrive under Richard Hayes's transformative leadership. The Bright Futures Fund became a model for other companies, demonstrating that investing in employees and their families was both a humane and sustainable strategy. Now, 60 years old, Richard decided it was time to step back from the company's daily operations. He had spent the last decade turning Hayes Corporation into a place that not only generated profits, but also changed lives. In his final company-wide meeting as CEO, Richard gathered employees in a large auditorium adorned with images representing the company's journey. He stepped onto the stage and, for the first time, spoke openly about the experience that had changed his life. "Many years ago, I made an unusual decision. I went undercover as an employee to understand the reality of my own company. At that moment, I realized how disconnected I had become. What I lived and learned transformed my view of leadership and, most importantly, of humanity." He paused, looking out at the crowd. Among them were Maria, now a senior manager, and James, who had risen to become director of operations. You taught me that leadership is not just about guiding, but about listening, understanding, and acting. Thank you for trusting me to change and for making me a better leader." The audience erupted in emotional applause. Employees from all levels stood to honor the man who had transformed their lives and the company's culture. After the speech, Maria and James joined him on stage. Smiling, Maria took the microphone. "Mr. Hayes, on behalf of all the employees at Hayes Corporation, we want you to know that your impact goes far beyond this company. You've changed lives, not just ours, but also those of our families. And today, we want to thank you in a special way." They handed Richard a large plaque, engraved with a message. Asterisk. "Thank you for showing us that true leadership is built on courage, empathy, and action. Your legacy will be eternal." Asterisk. As he held the plaque, Richard reflected on how far he had come since the day he disguised himself to understand his team's challenges. The transformation wasn't just about the company, it had been about himself. Richard left Hayes Corporation knowing it was in good hands. He continued to serve as a consultant for other companies, helping leaders adopt more humane and effective practices. More importantly, he embraced a more balanced life, traveling, writing about his experiences, and spending time with his family. Hayes Corporation thrived under its new leadership, and the Bright Futures Fund ensured that dozens of young people could study, grow, and pursue careers that once seemed impossible. Among them was Sophia, Maria's daughter, who graduated as a doctor and dedicated her life to helping children with heart conditions like the one she had faced. Years later, Richard sat on a bench in a Chicago park, reading a newspaper. A young man approached him and asked, "Are you Richard Hayes? I've heard your story. Is it true you started everything by going undercover as an employee?" Richard smiled. "Yes, it was the best decision I ever made. It taught me that to truly lead, you must live the reality of the people who trust you." As the young man thanked him and walked away, Richard gazed at the horizon with a peaceful smile. He had left a legacy not just as a businessman, but as someone who proved that empathy and action have the power to change the world. This story reminds us that true leadership is born from humility and the desire to understand and serve others. Transforming lives and creating lasting impact is the greatest legacy one can leave.